It was a dark and rainy night when I got the emergency call. My partner, Marcus, and I were dispatched to a car accident on the road, cutting through the dense woods on the outskirts of town. When we arrived, the headlights of our patrol cars illuminated the scene. An overturned car with smoke billowing from the engine. An elderly woman was sitting in the passenger seat, visibly in shock, but seemingly uninjured. I approached her, trying to offer comfort. "Ma'am, it's all right now. What happened?" She looked at me with empty eyes, but her voice was clear when she replied, "I don't know what happened. They came out of nowhere. They attacked me." While Marcus inspected the car, I tried to keep the woman calm. Within minutes, the ambulance arrived with paramedics Jane and Peter, who immediately began assessing the woman's condition. "There are no serious injuries," Jane said, puzzled, "but she's in shock. We need to get her to the hospital." As the paramedics prepared the stretcher, Marcus and I tried to find out more about what had happened. "Ma'am, can you tell us who did this? How did it happen?" I asked gently. She just shook her head and murmured, "They came from the darkness. The criminals. I was on my way home. They got me." Peter, who was checking the woman's vital signs, looked at Jane with a confused expression. "This doesn't make sense. Her vital signs are abnormal." Before Jane could respond, the temperature around us suddenly dropped. A thick mist began to form, bringing with it an eerie feeling that something wasn't right. Suddenly, my radio crackled with static, and a muffled voice came through. "Officer Richard, this is Central. We've just received crucial information about the case. The woman you found, she was declared dead 2 hours ago. Her body was discovered on the road, brutally murdered by criminals." I looked at Marcus, the hairs on my arms standing on end. We slowly turned to the woman, who was now looking at us with a disturbing smile. Her eyes were empty, lifeless. Before we could react, the woman began to dissolve into mist before our eyes, her body slowly fading into the cold night air. The paramedics and I stood frozen, trying to process what had just happened. The next day, the road was closed off for investigations. We discovered that the elderly woman had been kidnapped and killed by a group of criminals who abandoned her on the road. But the mystery of the spirit that seemed so real remained. I'll never forget that night. To me, that road will always be marked by the presence of a woman who sought justice in a way no one could ever fully understand.
It was a moonless night, and I was driving my old rig down Highway 66, a desolate stretch of road with no end in sight. The radio crackled with static, and the only company I had was the constant rumble of the engine. The load was urgent, and I needed to make it on time, even if it meant driving through the night alone. Things started to get strange when I passed a stretch of road that seemed abandoned for decades. The trees were darker, and the fog thickened, making visibility almost non-existent. My headlights cut through the mist, but it felt like the darkness was swallowing the light. That's when I saw it for the first time, a figure on the side of the road. I kept my eyes peeled, thinking it might be an animal, but it moved in a way that was unnatural, almost otherworldly. The figure seemed to be watching me, and as I passed by, a chill ran down my spine. I glanced in the rearview mirror, but there was nothing. I decided to speed up. Further down the road, things took a turn for the worse. The trees seemed to close in on me like claws, and the fog became almost solid. The dashboard lights started flickering, and the engine sputtered. With one last gasp, the truck came to a stop. There I was, stuck in the middle of nowhere. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped out to check the engine. As I popped the hood, the flashlight flickered and went out. An eerie silence enveloped the area. Then I heard footsteps in the woods nearby. I grabbed a metal pipe and braced myself for whatever was out there. The footsteps got closer, but I saw nothing. Suddenly, a whispering voice called my name. It was a voice I had never heard before, but it seemed to know everything about me. My deepest fears started to surface, and the whispering turned into a chorus of anguished murmurs. Not knowing what else to do, I ran back to the truck, but the door was locked. That's when I saw a cabin in the distance, a faint light flickering in its window. Desperate for help, I made my way toward it. With each step, the air grew heavier and the whispers intensified. When I reached the cabin, I pushed open the creaking wooden door. Inside, dust and cobwebs covered everything. The only light came from a nearly spent candle on a rickety table. In the center of the room was an old, dusty journal. I opened it and began to read. The pages were filled with accounts of people who had disappeared on that road, each one describing terrifying visions and encounters with the supernatural. The last entry mentioned a curse placed by a witch who lived in the forest. When I looked up from the journal, I saw the figure of a woman in the corner of the room. Her eyes glowed with a sinister light, and a malevolent smile spread across her face. Before I could react, the candle went out, plunging the cabin into total darkness. I felt a cold hand touch my shoulder, and a deadly chill seeped into my bones. The whispering voice returned, now inside my mind, repeating words I couldn't understand. My vision blurred, and I collapsed to the floor, unable to move. When I woke up, I was back in my truck, the engine running as if nothing had happened. The road was clear, and the sun was beginning to rise on the horizon. I looked around, searching for any sign of the cabin, but there was nothing. Everything seemed normal, but I knew it wasn't. Something had changed inside me, a mark left by that nightmarish encounter. Since then, I avoid that road at all costs. But sometimes, when I'm alone in the cab, I still hear the whispers calling me back to that road. It was a dark and stormy night, and I was behind the wheel of my truck, driving down a deserted road in the middle of nowhere. The rain was pouring down in sheets, and the sound of the wind howling through the cracks in the windows was almost deafening. I was carrying a valuable and dangerous load, a shipment of high-tech electronics, and I knew that cargo thieves were lurking in the area. I've been on the road for over 20 years. I've seen a lot of strange and terrifying things, but nothing could have prepared me for what happened that night. It all started when I saw something on the side of the road. It was a shadowy figure standing in the rain, frantically waving. Against my better judgment, I slowed down and stopped. It was a man, drenched and shivering, with a look of desperation in his eyes. "Please, help me," he begged. "My wife. She's in that cabin up there. She needs help." I looked in the direction he was pointing and saw a dirt trail leading to an abandoned cabin. I hesitated, but the urgency in his voice convinced me to help. I told him to get in the truck, and we drove up the muddy trail to the cabin. The cabin looked like it had been abandoned for years. The windows were broken, and the door creaked ominously in the wind. When we stepped inside, a sense of unease washed over me. The interior was dark, except for a flickering candle in one corner. The man led me to a room where his wife lay on a makeshift bed, pale and weak. "She's been sick for days," he said. "We need medical help." As I tried to figure out how to help, I heard a noise outside. My heart started racing. I quickly went out to investigate and saw something that froze me in place. 3 hooded figures were surrounding my truck, trying to break into the cargo hold. They were cargo thieves, and I knew they were after the electronics. "Hey, get away from there!" I shouted, trying to scare them off. But instead of running, they turned toward me with sinister smiles. "They're with me," the man's voice sounded behind me, and I turned to see him holding a gun, aimed straight at me. "Thanks for bringing us here. Now we need your cargo." I was trapped. They forced me to open the truck, and they started looting the cargo. Meanwhile, the man's wife appeared in the doorway of the cabin. her face now twisted into a sinister smile, completely different from the weak woman I had seen minutes earlier. That's when I started seeing the visions. Ghostly figures danced in the shadows, deformed faces emerged from the darkness, and whispers seemed to come from all around me. I couldn't tell if I was losing my mind or if it was all real. The thieves laughed at my confusion and kept loading up the goods. But suddenly, one of them screamed and collapsed to the ground, writhing in pain. A ghostly figure, with glowing eyes and a mouth full of sharp teeth, hovered over him. The others tried to run, but the visions got them too, one by one. I just stood there, frozen, watching as the ghostly creatures consumed the thieves. The man and his wife simply watched, their faces now showing a twisted pleasure. When it was all over, the figures vanished, and I was left alone on the road, with an empty truck and the ruins of the cabin behind me. I still don't know if what I saw was real or just hallucinations brought on by fear and stress. But one thing's for sure, I never drove down that road again, and I never stopped to help strangers at night. The memory of that abandoned cabin and those terrifying visions still haunts me, and every time I'm on the road, I feel like something or someone is watching me from the shadows.